The human mind is both a beacon of rationality and a vessel for the inexplicable. Throughout history, certain events defy logical explanation, intertwining the supernatural with personal experiences. Such stories persist across cultures, whispered around campfires, recorded in forgotten manuscripts, and echoed in the minds of those who have witnessed the unexplainable. This is one such tale, a story that bridges the gap between love, loss, and the unknown. It is a testament to the human tendency to seek patterns in chaos, to find meaning where none may exist, and to fear the forces beyond our control. A man, haunted by his past, entangled in his beliefs, and bound by a mysterious sequence of events, meets his inevitable fate. But was it mere coincidence, or was it the inescapable pull of destiny? Is there a hidden order in the universe that we fail to comprehend? Could our deepest fears and desires manifest into reality? Or are we simply prisoners of our own perceptions, conjuring phantoms in the dark corners of our minds? This story forces us to question whether the events that shape our lives are merely accidents, or if something far more sinister is at play. After spending decades in Hong Kong, a successful businessman, now a middle-aged man, finally decides to return to his homeland, the United States. His business ventures had granted him immense wealth and status, yet the thrill of financial success had long faded into the background, replaced by a peculiar sense of nostalgia and an unshakable curiosity about an old friend from his youth. Before heading to New York, where his life awaited, he made an unplanned detour to San Francisco. This city had always fascinated him with its fog-covered streets, echoes of the gold rush era, and whispers of old secrets. It was a city with a long history of strange occurrences, ghostly sightings in the old mansions, whispers of unsolved mysteries drifting through its alleyways, and the eerie presence of something unseen lurking in its dense mist. Yet, it was not the city itself that called to him. It was Munn Dampier, an eccentric and enigmatic figure from his past, whose fascination with the occult had once been a source of both amusement and concern. Dampier had always been different, his mind lost in ancient manuscripts, his conversations peppered with cryptic references to forgotten rituals and unseen forces. The businessman recalled their last encounter years ago, when Dampier had spoken of an experiment he was conducting, something about the power of thought, the transmission of energies, and the way unseen forces could shape the material world. Back then, he had dismissed it as the ramblings of a man too engrossed in his books. But now, after all these years, there was an urgency in the letter Dampier had sent him, an insistence that he come at once. It was not curiosity alone that compelled him to visit, it was a nagging feeling that something was very, very wrong. Munn Dampier had never worked a conventional job. His father, a man of considerable means, had provided for him, allowing him to immerse himself in the study of the arcane. Even in their younger years, Dampier's obsession with the mystical had set him apart. He spent hours poring over ancient texts, discussing supernatural theories, and conducting rituals that few understood. To many, he was a harmless recluse. To others, he was a man dabbling in forces beyond comprehension. Now, after years of silence, the businessman was eager to reunite with his old friend. He could recall the vibrant conversations they once shared, talks of history, literature, and most notably, the mystical and arcane. But something had changed. The man he was about to see had become a shadow of his former self, living in a self-imposed exile surrounded by books that spoke of things beyond the grasp of reason. As he approached the residence, the very air felt different, heavy, as if charged with an unseen force. The mist clung to the edges of the house like ghostly fingers, and the garden, once full of life, had withered into a collection of tangled, lifeless vines. The house itself, a structure of aged stone and darkened windows, stood as a monument to forgotten times. He could not shake the feeling that this visit was more than a mere reunion. It felt like he was stepping into a story already written, a fate already sealed. Something awaited him in the eerie stillness of Dampier's home, something that had been waiting for years. He could not yet understand it, nor could he foresee how this visit would unravel a tale of dread, mystery, and an ominous fate that had been set into motion long ago. But he knew one thing for certain. Once he crossed the threshold, there would be no turning back. What he finds upon arrival is a stark contrast to the man he once knew. Dampier, once vibrant and full of youthful arrogance, now appears aged beyond his years. His once dark hair has turned an almost ghostly white, his face lined with deep creases that tell of restless nights and unspoken burdens. His skin, waxen and drawn, clings tightly to his bones, giving him the spectral appearance of a man who has one foot in this world and the other in the next. The long silk coat he wears, once elegant, is now tattered at the edges, hanging loosely over his emaciated frame. His old-fashioned slippers shuffle against the wooden floor, their movement eerily slow and deliberate, as though every step is a great effort. But it is his words that send the first chill down the narrator's spine. His voice, barely above a whisper, carries an unsettling weight. "I'm not as I was. Latin is a dead language, and I am a dead man." The words hang heavy in the dimly lit room, thick with an ominous finality. It is not merely an expression of weariness, but a forewarning, an acknowledgment of something the narrator is yet to comprehend. A premonition, perhaps, of the fate that awaits them both. Dampier's house is an imposing, lonely structure near the Pacific Ocean, its eerie presence amplified by the ceaseless roar of the waves crashing against the rocky cliffs below. The sky is an ominous shade of gray, thick with heavy clouds that threaten to consume the last remnants of daylight. Wind howls through the barren trees surrounding the property, their skeletal branches scratching against the stone walls like desperate fingers seeking entry. The house itself, built in a time long forgotten, bears the weight of its years. Cracked bricks and ivy-covered facades tell a story of neglect, of a place that has not known warmth or laughter in decades. Its windows are dark, hollow voids reflecting the stormy sky, offering no sign of the life within. The only part of the structure that seems well maintained is the tower at one end of the house, rising like a sentinel against the relentless tide of time. It is there that Dampier resides, secluded from the rest of the world, as though he had become as much a part of the tower as the stones themselves. His invitation is peculiar. He instructs his friend to enter unannounced, bypassing the usual courtesies of knocking or ringing the bell. The front door, he claims, will be left open, waiting like a gaping mouth in the face of the coming storm. The narrator hesitates at the threshold, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down upon him. But he takes a breath and steps inside, unaware that with this single act, he has crossed into a realm where logic and reason will soon unravel. Upon entering, the narrator finds himself in a dimly lit room, where shadows dance on the walls, flickering unnaturally as though moved by an unseen presence. The air is thick with the scent of old paper, burnt wax, and something faintly metallic, an aroma that unsettles the senses. A single candle flickers on a wooden table, casting long, distorted silhouettes against the stone walls. The atmosphere is suffocating, as if the house itself is holding its breath. The conversation between the two old friends is strained, marked by an uneasy silence. Dampier's voice, once rich and confident, is now a whisper barely carried by the stagnant air. His gaze flickers toward the corners of the room, toward the walls, toward something unseen. He speaks in fragmented sentences, as though distracted by something the narrator cannot perceive. Then, as if on cue, the sound begins: tap, tap, tap. The soft, deliberate knocking sends a shiver down his spine. It is measured, almost methodical, neither aggressive nor hesitant, but impossibly precise. The sound does not seem to come from a specific direction but rather resonates through the very foundation of the house, like a vibration pulsing through the walls. The narrator feels an inexplicable chill settle deep in his bones. It is not merely a sound, it is a presence, an intrusion into the space around them. Something, or someone, is making itself known. Dampier's reaction is unsettling. He freezes, his breath catching in his throat as his wide, glassy eyes dart between the shadows flickering on the walls. A tremor runs through his frail frame, but whether it is from fear or exhilaration, the narrator cannot tell. It is as though the very sound has gripped his soul, tightening its hold with every passing second. His lips part slightly, murmuring something barely audible, an incantation, a prayer, or perhaps a plea. Then, with sudden intensity, he speaks, his voice hoarse but resolute. "This is no ordinary noise," he whispers, the words laced with reverence and trepidation. "It is a sign, a message from beyond." The narrator, though skeptical, cannot deny the charged atmosphere in the room. There is something unnatural about the way the sound seems to linger, as though it exists outside the bounds of time itself. When pressed about its origin, Dampier merely raises a trembling hand and gestures toward the wall. His fingers, gnarled and pale, seem almost reluctant to point at the very thing he both dreads and adores. His voice, though unsteady, carries an urgency that is impossible to ignore. "You must stay," he pleads. "There is a story I must tell. And once you hear it, you will understand." Dampier recounts a memory that has haunted him for a decade. He once lived in a small apartment on Rincon Hill, a neighborhood that had seen better days, where the streets were lined with forgotten remnants of a more prosperous past, crumbling buildings, abandoned houses, and alleyways that whispered secrets in the wind. Among the transience and decay, there was one presence that stood out against the desolation, a young woman whose beauty seemed almost otherworldly. She had piercing brown eyes, deep and full of unspoken stories, the kind that captured the imagination and refused to let go. There was a sorrow in them, a depth that suggested she had lived a life far more complex than her modest station would suggest. Her delicate features were framed by dark, wavy hair, often tucked beneath a simple bonnet, though wisps would escape to brush against her cheeks in the evening breeze. Though she wore the plain garments of a servant, there was something regal about her demeanor, a quiet grace that made her seem untouched by the hardships of her station. She moved through the world as if she belonged to another time, another place, one far removed from the mundane reality of her duties. Her posture was upright, her step deliberate, her gestures refined, as though she had been raised on whispered poetry and the rustling of silk rather than the clatter of dishes and the scent of soap. Dampier often saw her standing by the market stalls, her fingers lightly brushing the fruits she could never afford, or pausing by the bookstore, her eyes scanning the spines of novels she could not buy. There was a yearning in her movements, a quiet hunger for something beyond the limitations of her role. He wondered what books she would choose, what stories she longed to lose herself in. Was she content with her life, or did she dream of something greater? Did she know that someone was watching, captivated by her every move? She was a mystery that Dampier found himself drawn to in ways he could not explain. Though he never spoke to her, he studied her every movement, noting the way she carried herself, the fleeting expressions that crossed her face, the moments she seemed lost in thought while staring out of the window of her small attic room. Her existence was simple, unnoticed by most, but to Dampier she became an obsession, an enigma that he could not decipher, a puzzle that refused to be solved. He never spoke to her. Instead, he watched, tracing her movements with an intensity he barely understood himself. He learned her habits, the times she would return from errands, the moments she would pause at her window, lost in thought. Each stolen glance, each silent observation, only deepened his infatuation. One evening, by pure chance, he overheard the landlady mention that the girl lived in the room next to his. The revelation sent a shiver down his spine. Only a thin wall separated them. The thought consumed him. He imagined her on the other side, sleeping just feet away, breathing the same stale air of the old building. The proximity made his obsession unbearable. One night, unable to contain himself, he tapped on the wall. A single, deliberate motion. He held his breath, feeling foolish, and yet exhilarated by his own daring. Seconds passed, stretching into eternity. Then, to his astonishment, she responded. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. It sent a thrill through his veins, electrifying and unreal. In that moment, they were connected, bound by an unspoken understanding through the worn wooden planks that separated their worlds. This silent exchange became their only form of communication. Nights passed with their unspoken conversations, and in those fleeting moments, Dampier felt as though he had found a connection unlike any he had known before. He imagined the world on the other side of the wall, her dreams, her fears, the quiet rhythm of her breath in the darkness. Then, one day, she disappeared. The usual sounds of her footsteps in the hallway, the soft hum of her voice as she completed her chores, the faint rustle of fabric as she sat by her window, all were gone. An unnatural stillness replaced the comforting familiarity of her presence. Panic gripped him. He inquired about her whereabouts, but his questions were met with hushed tones and downcast eyes. Finally, the landlady revealed the heartbreaking truth: she had fallen ill. The fever had taken hold of her swiftly, leaving her frail and delirious. In her final moments, she had made a single request. She had asked for her bed to be moved next to the wall, the same wall against which Dampier had once tapped. It was as though, even in the haze of fever and approaching death, she still longed for the silent connection they had shared. Hours later she died, her fingers resting gently against the wooden barrier, as if reaching out for one last message that would never come. Dampier, steeped in his studies of occult philosophy, recalled the teachings of a mystic named Necromantia. According to the doctrine, supernatural occurrences often manifest in patterns of three, the fatal triad. Each event, when repeated twice before, ensures that the third occurrence seals the cycle, marking the culmination of fate's design. He had heard the tapping twice before, once from the girl, when she had answered his signal through the wall, and again on the night of her death, when her final breaths had seemingly carried through the silence. Each time, it had sent a chill through him, as though unseen hands were reaching through the veil of reality, grasping at something intangible. Now, with his old friend present, the sound had returned for the third time, reverberating like an ethereal verdict pronounced by forces unseen. The tapping was steady, deliberate, neither a product of the wind nor the creaks of an aging house. It seemed to exist beyond the material world, a rhythm belonging to something outside the laws of nature. Dampier felt its weight pressing against his chest, a force that was both calling and condemning him. The air grew heavy, thick with an indescribable presence that coiled around them like an invisible specter. He clenched his fists, his breath shallow, his pulse erratic. "This is it," he whispered, his voice carrying the solemnity of a man who had glimpsed his own fate and found no way to escape it. A chill ran through Dampier as he realized that he was not merely an observer of this phenomenon. He was an integral part of it. The pattern had not chosen him at random. It had waited patiently for the cycle to close. Every whisper of fate, every echo of the past, had led him to this moment. He was no longer a bystander in the grand design. He was its final act, the inevitable conclusion to a story that had long been written in unseen ink. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching as if reaching for him. His breath quickened, his pulse drumming in his ears, but he remained still, transfixed by the realization that he had always belonged to this fate. The air grew colder, the very walls seeming to pulsate with an unseen energy, and Dampier, for the first time in his life, felt utterly powerless against the forces that had woven themselves into his existence. There was no escaping it now, no rewriting the final chapter. He was the last note in a song long sung, the final flicker of a candle before the darkness consumed it whole. "It is complete," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers trembled as he reached for a nearby candle, its dim glow doing little to ward off the darkness creeping into the corners of the room. "The third call has come. And with it, so does the end." Believing that this was the completion of the triad, Dampier sank deeper into his chair, his expression a mixture of resignation and quiet terror. He exhaled slowly, his breath shallow, as though he could already feel the weight of the inevitable pressing down on him. "There is no undoing what has been set into motion," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. "It was always meant to end this way." The narrator, disturbed by the story and the chilling ambience, felt an urgent need to escape the oppressive air of the room. The walls, which had seemed sturdy upon his arrival, now felt as if they were closing in, suffused with an unseen force that pulsed like a heartbeat. He rose to leave, his hands cold and unsteady, but before he could step toward the door, a final gust of wind rattled the window panes, extinguishing the lone candle in the room. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment neither man spoke. The silence was absolute, suffocating, stretching impossibly long before a final, unmistakable sound shattered it. The narrator bolted for the door, his heart hammering as he tore through the dimly lit hallway and into the stormy night. Rain lashed against his skin as he stumbled into the waiting cab, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He did not look back. He dared not. But even as the carriage pulled away, he swore he could still hear it, faint, insidious, whispering through the rain. The next morning, a servant arrived with somber news. Munn Dampier had died in the night. Was Dampier's death a mere coincidence, or was he truly a victim of the supernatural? This question lingers in the shadowy recesses of the mind, a paradox where logic and mystery converge. Psychology provides a compelling perspective, offering insight into the human tendency to weave narratives from chaos. Individuals deeply invested in occult beliefs often develop a heightened sense of perception, interpreting ordinary events as mystical signs. This phenomenon, known as apophenia, is the mind's attempt to impose meaning upon randomness, seeing patterns where none may exist. The mind, after all, is a storyteller, crafting illusions from whispers, shaping fears into prophecies. In the case of Dampier, was it merely the weight of his beliefs that led him to his doom? Or had his subconscious already predetermined an end that his conscious mind refused to accept? The deeper one delves into the psyche, the more blurred the lines become between perception and reality, between what is imagined and what is truly lurking in the dark. Furthermore, the tapping itself may have been a psychological projection, a manifestation of Dampier's guilt, grief, and repressed emotions. The subconscious mind, when burdened with unresolved trauma, can fabricate sensory experiences so vivid that they seem indistinguishable from reality. In moments of extreme distress, auditory and tactile hallucinations can arise, reinforcing deeply ingrained fears. Could it be that Dampier, tormented by his past, externalized his guilt through an imagined phenomenon? The human psyche, particularly under prolonged isolation and obsession, has the capacity to generate apparitions, echoes of past regrets that take shape in the physical world. His belief in the occult, his unspoken love for the girl, and his years of solitude could have conspired to create the very experience that haunted him. Yet, despite these explanations, the mystery lingers. The tapping was not heard by Dampier alone. What, then, of the narrator? What of the eerie pattern, the fatal triad, that seemed to predict his demise? If this was all a projection of the mind, why did its final act coincide so precisely with reality? The story of Munn Dampier remains an enigma, a fusion of psychological turmoil, supernatural possibility, and the weight of unresolved emotions. Whether one views it through the lens of rational skepticism or mystical wonder, one truth remains: there are occurrences that defy logical understanding, slipping through the cracks of reason like whispers lost in the void. Perhaps the tapping was an unconscious projection of a mind burdened by grief. Perhaps it was an omen, a spectral echo reaching across the veil. Or perhaps, within the silent spaces of the world, there exists a force we are not yet meant to comprehend, an unspoken dialogue between the living and the dead, a rhythm that pulses beneath the fabric of existence, waiting for the right soul to hear it. In the end, Dampier's tale does not offer answers, only questions that echo long after the final tap, tap, tap has faded into silence. The weight of his story lingers, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be unraveled. Perhaps, in the stillness of the night, when the world is at its quietest, you too may hear it, the soft, deliberate knocking that calls from the unseen. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to continue building your English vocabulary through immersive storytelling. Join us for more captivating tales, and take your English learning to the next level.